This one's a classic.
Howdy everybody, it's me, Dragon Knight Togain, stranded at level 100. A few months back, the old school MapleStory recreation known as Artale was launched, and we had a hell of a time progressing a Dragon Knight from level 1 to 100. There was, however, a content drought after this point. No fourth job to look forward to, or even any high-level endgame training areas available beyond what I had already reached. Hime's became my best training spot, and they hit way too hard and drained potions like crazy. I could have aimed to unlock and clear Papulatus, but it was almost pointless to do so since I would serve practically no purpose in that boss on a low-level Dragon Knight. My only role was to provide hyper body, and if I'm being honest, I was mad burnt out anyway. Without any endgame content to look forward to after a couple months of intense progression, my motivation completely dried up, so I stepped away for a while. The announcement of fourth job's release sometime in March, however, meant that it was time for me to finally reveal a small project I had been working on in secret up until now. You can consider this the beginning of the long road to fourth job. When I reached level 100, I donated just about every Meso I had to the priest I was training with at the time, roughly 30 million Mesos or so, nothing insane. This set me back to a starting point that I figured would make for good content in the future, even if it meant a tiresome grind on my part. It was likely I would be spending a huge amount of time farming the Mesos I would need for the next step of progression, and so I wanted to document this process. I have a lot of thoughts on Meso farming in old school MapleStory. Certain classes have advantages in this field. Certain areas, updates, balance changes, and unique Artale content can alter this class balance. It's not always as simple as just going to the highest level monster and killing. It's not always as simple as farming the monster with the 1 billion Meso rare drop. It's a delicate balance between your own boredom and the value you receive in-game for your time spent. I struggled greatly to figure out how to best farm Mesos as a lone Dragon Knight without a priest by my side. So, what's the answer? How do you make Mesos as a regular solo player? The answer, like most everything in old school MapleStory, is grinding. The road to fourth job begins with a journey of wealth acquisition. Before I could really get started on that journey, I set my eyes on a simple initial upgrade. I'm currently rocking an Omega Spear as my DPS weapon and the Gold Dragon as my mobbing weapon. The only upgrade I can make to my DPS weapon at the moment is the very overpriced Fair Frozen, a weapon I would need to upgrade to eventually, but it's not a high priority for me to do so right now. My mobbing weapon, on the other hand, could definitely use an upgrade. Before the release of Deep Aqua Road, the highest level, fastest polearm available is the Eclipse. It drops from Gatekeepers and King Sage Cat, neither of which were monsters that I was all that interested in farming myself. Gatekeepers drain all cure potions, and King Sage Cat is an area boss. They're just not reasonably farmable without some starting capital. At the beginning of this wealth acquisition journey, the price of a mediocre Eclipse was around 10 to 20 million Mesos. Prices have dropped since then, thankfully, as supply increased and demand decreased, but past me doesn't live in the present. So, our first goal in this video is going to be farming the necessary Mesos for the Eclipse Fund. The reason this is considered an upgrade worth making is not due to it being a massive increase in damage output necessarily, but rather its attack speed being 1 level faster than the Gold Dragon. In my mind, the first stop to achieve this weapon upgrade was farming Lucidas in Orbis, something we've seen Tiger do in the past. This is not the best idea though, as it turns out. The major issue here is that it takes me 2 crushers to kill a Lucida. This gives them just enough time to fire off an attack, and Lucidas never miss. On top of this, there's nothing on a Lucida's drop table that's all that valuable, so we were looking at NPC fodder for just about every drop. The green pirate top and bottom could roll high and yield good Mesos in turn, but otherwise there's nothing on their drop table that I was looking out for. Couple this with the low spawn, mediocre map layout, and near guaranteed damage taken per Lucida, and we're looking at a not too optimal farming spot. My primary motivator for being here in the first place was because I was under the false impression that Lucidas dropped the eclipse I was looking for. I have no idea where I picked up this idea, as I can't find the Lucida eclipse drop on any database that exists. I guess I just made it up. Despite how inefficient this map was, I spent a few days at Lucida's regardless, spamming Crusher with my Omega Spear and slowly building up the Eclipse Fund. Shout out to the mini drops I received that kept this spot viable. This Eclipse purchase sets me back to near zero, but it allows me to comfortably dash through maps, dispatching lower level enemies much more efficiently than the Gold Dragon did. Step number 1 was completed, and it was time to work on the much loftier goal that would take me weeks at least to accomplish. With my Eclipse in hand, let's explore some serious Meso-making opportunities. This is where I really dug deep and decided to take a good look at the areas available to me as a level 100 Dragon Knight. There are a number of factors at play here that we'll need to keep in mind. All of these factors have to be taken into account in order to determine the Meso King. Raw Meso income is pretty straightforward. It's simply the amount of Mesos we get from drops per hour. Etc. item income might come as a bit of a surprise for people who haven't heavily scrutinized their Meso farming, but as it turns out, it's actually pretty majorly impactful and something worth calculating. Etc. items drop so frequently that they can be tracked with incredibly high accuracy and consistency. Potion cost is the biggest killer, making spots that are otherwise great income nearly worthless. Valuable item drops are almost impossible to calculate, unfortunately, due to RNG. Unlike with etc. items, there's no way to consistently track the value of dropped items outside of just putting in hours upon hours of grinding and calculating an average over time. So we'll drop that aspect. It can, however, take a mediocre spot and turn it into the greatest potential moneymaker, which is one of the reasons why lycanthropes can be so insanely valuable to farm, despite being a very expensive monster to train at. Something to keep in mind for sure, but not for our purposes in this video. In my experience, wild cargoes are the most enjoyable to farm, and they consistently yield the best income with almost no expenses. So that's where I'll be spending most of my time starting out. Just enough to build a base of Mesos that would provide me many hours of comfortable farming at higher cost spots. Potions are expensive. So we have our destination, but what's our monetary goal exactly? In my mind, I wanted to make sure I at least had the Mesos available for both the level 70 and 120 mounts before starting the grind to level 120. This is a grand total of 70 million Mesos required at the minimum, and I also kind of wanted to earn back the 30 million I gave away. This would allow me to reach 9 digits if I had the patience to achieve it. We'll make this 100 million Mesos our overall goal for now. It's a pretty substantial one. The homogenization of modern MapleStory planted this seed in my mind years ago that everyone needs to have the same tools available to them. But that's just not how old-school MapleStory works. In a more macro sense, that's not how life works. We all have different tools, different opportunities, and the trade-off for warriors is crazy when you think about it. Yeah, I have to farm at level 50 to 60 monsters to make consistent early profit, but then I remember how insane warriors are in a third job meta overall, and this seems like such a non-issue. For so long, I was concerned with trying to play like a hermit, going to areas that simply wouldn't work for a Dragon Knight, hoping to somehow utilize them as farming spots regardless. It's hard to get out of the mindset that we ought to have access to the exact same tools as everyone else, despite us all being different. It took me a while to recalibrate, but once I started to accept this admittedly existential concept and realized that I had to play as a solo Dragon Knight, I suddenly began to make the forward progress I was looking for. Were other classes making faster progress? Probably. Some of them have more effective tools. Does this matter? Not at all. We're all headed to the same destination, and we'll get there at our own individual pace. Plus, I get to use cool dragon skills. Let's talk about area bosses, another potential Meso generator. With their guaranteed Meso bag drops, they're actually a somewhat viable method of acquiring wealth, but attempting to make a profit from area bosses can be very difficult. Even for a Dragon Knight, a class who has extra damage reduction through Power Crash, these bosses often hit too hard. All warriors from birth until level 200 suffer from one major weakness: they get hit too frequently. This is why they're the only ones who receive Power Stance in 4th job. This is why they have the highest natural HP pool in the game. This is why the skill Achilles exists. This is why Dragon Knights get elemental resistance, as we'll see soon. This unending stream of incoming damage is something I've always been aware of, certainly, but it has never been more obvious to me than when attempting to undertake this journey to 4th job. It was at the forefront of my mind when deciding on an area to farm. I thought in terms of how quickly my potions were drained, rather than how effectively I could avoid using potions at all. The latter simply wasn't a feasible option. That's not to say that warriors suffer alone, however. Squishy ranged classes can also run into a bit of a wall attempting to kill high-level area bosses who hit nearly 4,000 damage, unceremoniously one-shotting them and preventing them from farming effectively without hyperbody. For my purposes, these high damage rolls don't threaten my life, rather they threaten my wallet. Generally, it was possible for me to farm area bosses effectively enough that I was making a small profit, but Dragon Knights really aren't built to be 1v1 machines. Fighting area bosses for profit is the same logic as farming lycanthropes or a similar high-level monster with a potentially extremely valuable drop. I would just be gambling to actually make that profit. So I had a decision to make. Gamble for these high rolls, or steadily climb the Meso ladder until I reached that same point. It's really not an easy decision, but one is guaranteed and the other isn't, and when you're completely broke, you only have so much to work with. This is why I decided to forego area bosses. Even if we're not taking into consideration the availability of the boss itself, with everyone in the server trying to kill them, I'd rather take on the steady climb of Mesos over the random big payout for the time being. One of the biggest issues I was running into at Wild Cargoes was that my minimum damage wasn't quite high enough to one-shot them consistently. I don't believe it slowed down my rates as much as the layout of the map itself did, but it certainly felt inefficient at times. I needed something that had a more favorable HP value, and so this led me to Magadia. If I was two-shotting Wild Cargoes anyway, I might as well be at higher level monsters who could give better EXP and Mesos. First stop, Homans in the map Lab Unit 201 in Magadia. A flat map with an excellent layout, especially when compared to Wild Cargoes. I quickly found that this map had better EXP, better Mesos, an easier rotation, and a similar drop table to Wild Cargoes, including the potentially valuable Evil Wings and Sapphire Gigantics that could sell for a few million Mesos on a high roll. With a new training area that I would get to stare at for weeks, it was time for me to buckle down and slowly gather those Mesos. Over the next few weeks, on and off, I slowly farmed up these Mesos, gaining a significant amount of EXP in the process, actually. An hour here, an hour there. Anytime I felt like popping a quick R-Tail sesh, I made slightly more progress towards my goal. When the actual announcement for 4th Job dropped in early March, I buckled down and put in some serious hours, grinding the last 30 million Mesos I needed for my goal, but I was growing tired of these low-level spots. It was at this point that I began the quest to find our final farming spot for this 100 million Meso journey. First, I turned to Dark Yeti and Pepe's, a very popular spot. People love farming here, and they have one of the few remaining incredibly valuable scrolls that currently sells for over 15 million Mesos. Rolling even one of these would significantly speed up my grind, but the rates here simply weren't satisfactory otherwise. The EXP was pretty good. 1 million EXP an hour was almost decent, and the raw income before potion costs was awesome. When you add in those potion costs though, it ends up being less Mesos per hour than Lab Unit 201. Obviously, there's potential for high-value drops, but I wasn't exactly interested in slowing down my Meso acquisition rate to take on those odds. I instead headed to regular Yeti and Pepe's. Yeti and Pepe is a monster I idealized farming as a kid. When Deep El Nath was the endgame, every high-level player farmed here if they weren't at Bane's, and I figured this was my opportunity to finally be that high-level player. Previously, I had attempted to farm here, but I was running into a small issue of not being able to consistently two-shot. As I leveled up a couple more times and started dealing slightly more damage, two-shotting became more frequent, and I did another test. Just how efficient are these as a moneymaker on my now two-shotting Dragon Knight? I really expected Yeti and Pepe's to perform horribly, but as it turns out, it might be the single greatest farming spot for a Dragon Knight pre-Leafree. Claw attack 10%, cape dex 10%, bottom wear dex 60%, helmet int 60%, and the ever valuable steelies. Yeti and Pepe's are insanely stacked and not really over-farmed, since the majority of bots are Ice Lightning mages. Not really suited for these guys. On top of this insane drop pool that contains more valuable items than any other area, my tests showed that they were generating a raw 1.2 million Mesos per hour. This is after factoring in potion costs and everything. An insane rate compared to what I was used to at Wild Cargoes, and even higher than Lab Unit 201 by a small amount. This partially comes down to their ridiculously valuable etc. drops, believe it or not. In an hour, I'm generating over 600,000 Mesos in etc. drops alone from these guys, and my potion costs are minimal for some reason. I'm taking under 1,000 damage most of the time. I wanted to get my two-shotting capabilities even higher so that I could justify staying here, so I took some of the Mesos I had, and I invested in a stronger weapon. Possibly against my better judgment, it was time for me to embrace the Fair Frozen. We've entered a new chapter of the Dragon Knight's progression, so it was time to put down the Omega Spear and to make that upgrade. Now I'm a real Dragon Knight. This purchase again sets me back a bit more financially, but it was worth the investment to have the ability to consistently two-shot Yeti and Pepe's. We're a little over halfway to our goal now, and I was excited once again to begin farming with my new tool. Childhood me would be ecstatic at the prospect of spending so much time fighting these fuzzy creatures with penguins on their backs. Adult me, however, feeling a profound sense of post-creative depression after wrapping up a major project, just wants to watch some podcasts and burn away the time while I slowly reach my goal. This Yeti and Pepe supremacy is a bit confusing though from my perspective. Previously, when I tested Yeti and Pepe's, I found it nearly impossible to profit here. Now suddenly, it was the most profitable area for me to farm. After doing some thinking, I believe this is not only because of consistently two-shotting, but also due to the passive skill Elemental Resistance, which I mentioned earlier. This is a skill shared only by Dragon Knights and Priests. Mages receive gutted versions of this skill that increase their resistance against the elements that they would never be fighting in the first place given their skill sets. So that's kind of weird. A 40% reduction in damage from elemental resistance, plus the 11% reduction I currently receive from Power Crash, means I'm only taking 49% damage from these Yeti and Pepe's, even less than a Chief Bandit. I didn't actually test this myself, but from my observations, I think this is what makes this spot so viable for a Dragon Knight. It's interesting. The determining factor that makes Yeti and Pepe's such an insanely valuable monster to begin with is their mechanic of splitting into two enemies after taking down their combined form. This is why we get so many etc. drops. The initial body has its own drops, and both the split Yeti and the split Pepe have their own drops. This means we're basically killing 3 enemies for the price of 1. So many monsters are killed, in fact, that I actually consistently gained mana elixirs while farming here, despite using them as my MP potions. We just end up killing so many monsters per hour. It's wild. I think that's part of what makes it so satisfying as well. Ultimately, I ended up finding nothing of particularly significant value from Yeti and Pepe's, but the grind went by fast. It's a bit disappointing actually. I wanted a big moment where I found an expensive scroll or maybe even steelies, but it just didn't happen.
100 million Mesos.
100 million Mesos in pure cash has been secured though, and I was at least satisfied with this achievement. If there's anything I learned on this journey to 100 million Mesos, it's that patience is important. Was there perhaps a better way to approach building wealth without any capital to start with? Maybe. Thanks to Yeti and Pepe's, however, I think Dragon Knights in a third job meta are kind of crazy solo farmers once they have elemental resistance. The thing to keep in mind though is that 100 million Mesos is just the beginning. Such a huge portion of this is already committed to mounts, and having so much capital available to me now allows for a lot more freedom in approaching farming. I can take more risks on higher level enemies who can pay out higher amounts with big drops who won't sustain my potions as consistently. I can go farm area bosses without fear of running out of Mesos, and a good drop or two from those guys can net me ridiculous amounts. Way more than I would spend on potions even after hours and hours of hunting them. This 100 million Meso journey isn't the end. There are still 16 more levels, an entire job advancement, tons of 4th job skills to unlock, a grind to actually acquire mounts, bosses to clear as a hyper body and power crash mule, as well as plenty of future content to eventually explore.